Hey everybody, it's Robert Dunt from ArtTop10.com, and I'm very excited today to be speaking to Geraint Evans. Geraint, hello.
Hello, how you doing, Mark?
Very well, thank you. So we're both just surviving that football last-minute penalty horror, which I don't know about you. I've seen many penalty horrors with England. Have you seen?
Well, yeah, speaking as a Welshman, I've seen quite a few England penalty horrors and have a sort of ambivalent relationship to them. It was just great to see Wales do so well this championship. But yeah, stayed up last night, watched the game. I think Southgate did well to pragmatically get the team into the final. Maybe should have adjusted things in the second half.
Yeah.
But again, heroic failure is
Yeah.
a sort of it sort of suits the English or the British mentality, perhaps.
Perhaps it does actually. Yeah. So before we drift down that. Your paintings. I'm fascinated to hear more about them. Do you want to just give me a little sort of intro to yourself, your style of painting, and what got you into the whole thing in the first place?
Yeah, I've been painting for many, many years now. Studied originally in Manchester and then the Royal Academy schools back in the early 90s. And I've been teaching as well quite a lot. Been teaching the last 20 years, most recently at Camberwell College of Arts. The work mainly is a painting practice, drawing as well, the occasional animation, but not for a while. And essentially I'm interested in the ways in which people sort of understand, encounter, perceive the natural world. And I suppose the work is figurative. I'm interested in all sorts of things, such as portraiture. I'm interested in notions of failure, as it happens, talking about England, failure and aspiration. But this, thinking about the ways in which we understand the natural world has been a sort of fascination for me for the past sort of 10, 15 years or so. I'm interested in, for example, the ways in which we try to classify and control nature, the ways in which we even fabricate simulacra of the sort of natural world, the ways you might encounter that, for example, in theme parks or perhaps in shopping centres, the ways in which we create, I suppose, adventurous experiences within the natural world through tourism, and the ways in which, I suppose, we maybe make our own versions of nature within sort of gardens. So there's a whole range of things that have interested me.
So again, when you talked about a sort of simulacrum of nature in like supermarkets, do you mean like the pictures they'd have of a forest on the wall, or even like the fake sort of children's play areas with trees?
All of those things, yeah, absolutely. There used to be this really amazing small shopping mall in the Finchley Road, right on the way. If you ever went up to the Camden Arts Centre about 10 years ago, you'd pass the O2 Centre, which is still there.
Okay.
But in those days, they had this kind of theme where you'd enter into the shopping centre and then there'd be these fake rocks everywhere, and the actual escalator, which was right in front of you, took you to the top floor, had these kind of fiberglass cladding of these kind of rocks. So, and there were sort of fish tanks with exotic fish and lots of plants and bamboo everywhere. So there was this idea that you were sort of just stepping off the high street and then stepping into this kind of this kind of far-flung natural environment, which of course when you peeked through the bamboo you spotted the Boots or the or the McDonald's just in the undergrowth. So there's a sense, I thought about the ways in which I suppose this is enacted on often on a larger scale. So the ways in which tourism deals with encounters with nature, it allows us to get close. It allows us to think we're in a way stepping into the natural world if we visit I don't know, like a national park perhaps. But we know at the same time that it's all very safe and controlled. And I suppose it's what sort of chimed with me with some of the ideas like like Umberto Eco's writing, Travels in Hyperreality, which he talks about the idea of the copy of the simulacra, in a way sometimes being almost more authentic or perhaps being better than the real thing. And he makes some really interesting observations, for example, about Disneyland, which he calls the city of robots. And he talks about visiting Disneyland and then going to New Orleans and the Mississippi River and sort of standing there and thinking, well, I'd love to see sort of alligators and wild animals here, but, they can't be coaxed. Whereas in Disneyland, they are just, the animatronic animals are just there to be experienced. So there's this sort of interesting argument about you might construct that encounter with the natural world.
That's really intriguing, actually. So so when you go to Disneyland, you've almost got like a more guaranteed kind of experience. Because I remember we went to Yosemite in America a few years ago, and they always said put rocks in your trousers in case mountain lions come or whatever it was, or bears. Anyway, so my son was filling my pockets with all these rocks, which I had to stagger around with. We didn't see the mountain bear or the lion, but as you say, whereas if we'd been in a theme park, we would have seen the bear or the lion coming for us. But
well, interestingly, I went to Yosemite maybe 10 years ago, maybe longer than that, and again on a sort of driving trip around the western part of the United States, and I think to me when you go into, obviously Yosemite is a vast park, and it has what we might regard as wilderness, although what the definition of wilderness might be contested. If we witnessed it, is it really wilderness? But when you visit the sort of main Yosemite Valley, there is a sense of sort of control there. Obviously they need to manage the sheer amount of tourists. They need to kind of make sure that the car parks are there, that you can get yourself a burger, that you can go and visit the souvenir shop and get yourself an Ansel Adams postcard with a sort of Bridal Veil Falls, etc. So, and I remember going on a walk where I'd stopped off in the information booth and got my map so that I could go on this circuit, which would take me around the valley to be able to see all the great sights. And there are sort of echoes there, and the ways in which, for example, the great English landscape gardens of the sort of 18th, 19th century were designed. This idea of a circuit, once you took it, on the way it would reveal these great aspects, these great sort of sites, which might involve the Serpentine Lake or a sort of ruined. Well, I say a ruined Gothic building, but something that had been built, especially for the purpose, or it might be a grotto or something similar, so that these things would be revealed to you in a way that was, I suppose that in those days that was built, it was sort of designed on notions of the picturesque and the idea of making an equivalence between the design of a garden and painting, and the picturesque paintings of Claude Lorraine or something.
Interesting. It's like
although interestingly, if Rebecca Solnit in Wanderlust talks about that not in terms of a painting, but in terms of cinema, because she talks about the idea of walking this circuit as something that involves time rather than standing in one spot and just looking at a view.
That's very interesting, actually. I mean, it reminds me of those Jane Austen books where they're always going to see a vista that sort of, they're trying to look at something from a certain view, and they all go have their little picnic and they head out there, don't they? So in a way, you're saying our sort of way of trying to sort of manage nature is denatured it in a way.
Well, I suppose in a way that maybe I'm interested in what we might regard as being uncultivated or being wilderness, and I suppose denatured might be a way of thinking about it. But I guess there are different levels. So I suppose if you're encountering nature in your shopping mall down the road, it's probably is a different experience to placing rocks in your pockets to avoid the mountain lion attack. But there is still maybe, there's still analogies to be made, perhaps with maybe it's, I suppose, the root of it is thinking about the ways in which people view the world as a kind of from an anthropocentric position. So, in other words, placing ourselves at the center of the natural world instead of thinking of ourselves as being, just another element within the natural world, which is something that more in recent times, it might be sort of argued as a way of thinking more productively about the environment, etc.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Oh, yeah, so that's very interesting actually. So do you want to maybe show me either maybe some of the paintings in your studio or that sort of help to communicate this sort of fascination?
I don't know if you can see these.
Yeah.
These
You can always,
so,
wander it around if you want
to. Okay, so we have some paintings here.
Yeah. Okay. So that's like
so this painting.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this painting.
No, that's cool. That's cool.
It's quite a large painting. It's about 2 meters. It's all on canvas,
okay,
and
nice.
It's a painting of what I regard as an ornamental hermit. So it's an image, I guess, of an archetypal hermit who has retreated, in this case, to his attic.
Yeah.
And in my narrative, it's a kind of maybe a suburban house, and perhaps on the weekends, the owner of the house retreats to the attic to be alone and to stride amongst this kind of great mountain landscape which he has sort of constructed.
So
and I guess maybe there's a few themes that have come together in this painting. Part of it goes back to the landscape garden tradition. And when I first started thinking about gardens, I did some research about it and came across this concept of the ornamental hermit, who was not a real hermit.
Yeah.
But the idea was that if you built your garden, and maybe it was built on these principles of the kind of picturesque painting, and you wanted to show off to guests this garden, you should really populate it. So there was a kind of a moment where sort of landowners would sort of advertise for people to come and live within the grounds, and live as hermits, within sort of recently built hermitages, and to kind of just appear around the grounds for the sort of amusement of the landowner and guests alike. And perhaps the most famous example of this was a hermit that was employed by Charles Hamilton in his gardens in Paynes Hill, which is just off the A3 and the M25, not far from the M25 actually. And it's been restored recently, and it's a wonderful example, I guess, of that kind of garden, which has in which I suppose the idea of being uncultivated and slightly sort of shaggy rather than like super pristine it's a great example of that, and how that became really popular in the English landscape garden tradition. So he employed this guy to be the hermit, and I think after about 3 weeks he was caught down the pub having a sneaky pint and was dismissed. But the idea was that if he lived for 3 years and he just had these, very small amount of possessions, such as a sort of a robe and obviously a Bible and a few other things, then he would receive a pension for life, but obviously didn't make it. So I painted images of this hermit character for, there's many iterations of it, and so this is perhaps one of the more recent works, and I suppose it also conflates that with a sort of interest in the ways in which people might construct their own versions of wilderness or natural landscapes, particularly thinking of the model train enthusiasts.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So there's, I suppose it, in some ways, I think of some of these paintings that there's an interest, obviously, in a tradition of portrait within painting. And there are sort of good examples, I guess, of how the portrait was used to bring people in relation to nature. So we could think, I suppose, of people like Caspar David Friedrich, with the sort of lone figure within the landscape. But I'm also thinking about the sort of tradition of the conversation piece, which would place sort of landowners, and their families within the sort of grounds, and have their sort of the grounds that they owned as the backdrops for their paintings. So in a sense, trying to show how these landowners were both really invested in the natural world, but at the same time, had ownership of it, and showing off their sort of wealth to some degree. And maybe Gainsborough's Mr. and Mrs. Andrews is a sort of example of that. But I suppose there's also, I think of some of these paintings as being akin to a short story, perhaps. So I'm sort of imagining these characters and how they might be, and this is a small vignette, to illustrate a story that perhaps I'm sort of conjuring up in my imagination.
And yet, intriguingly in it, you've got, as well as the story, you've got, I mean, it's obviously beautifully painted, very neatly and cleanly done. Also, you've got quite a heavy sort of formal sort of crazy perspective thing with all the wooden slats. How do you feel that interacts with the kind of crazy hermit section?
Yeah, you're right. I think there are certain formal aspects of the work that really interest me. And I think I do... I have, I guess, purposely put in some of these sort of abstract sort of elements, thinking about some of the ways these kind of geometric shapes have been placed in there, with bright sort of colours. And I suppose really thinking about this element of the rafters as creating this, I suppose, in a way, a sense of, the hermitage itself, perhaps the idea of a cave, it's got that maybe spatial quality, but also there is a sort of a formal play, a sort of delight in creating this maybe this relationship between the sort of the geometric sort of structure of this building against then the slightly more messy quality of the landscape itself. So the actual image, it is a sort of it brings together a bunch of things. Some of it is generated by some of the images of the landscape.
No, that's good. Hang on, I think you might have just put your finger on the speaker for the. Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
So some of the images, say for example, of the mountains, came some from found imagery and some from photographs I took years ago when I did a residency at the Banff Centre for the Arts in Canada.
Nice.
The hermit is me, and I'm in a wizard beard and hair, bought from a local sort of party shop. The image of the rafters actually came from I think it was from The Guardian, and there was a story there in the finance section about the housing market, and so they had this picture of a house that was in the middle of being built, and had this. I just thought the formal composition of these rafters, really struck me. So I thought, well, I have to use that at some point in some ways.
Absolutely.
And, but this is the second version of this paint. I did another version, and it kind of worked, but it no longer exists. And so I made this painting again.
Okay, that's really cool. I love the fact you were the hermit yourself. That's quite.
So yeah, it is a recurring thing that I end up posing a lot for the protagonists in the work, and some of them. So, for example, in these.
Okay. We can see.
So we have a very small painting there of myself in a tree, which actually came from that same trip in Canada.
Oh, that's really cool. Can you zoom in on that anymore? The tree one.
What's that? Oh yeah.
Yeah. Just for a moment, just so we can see it. So that's really cool. I love it. Were you posing for that, or was that just accidental?
That was accidental. I think it was on that same trip, and we'd probably gone on many trips into the mountains, and I probably climbed up a tree and posed for the picture. But many years later, it was one of those that I hang around, and I just thought, well, at some point I should place myself as if enveloped within
the nature,
within the foliage, and the idea, I suppose, is that the foliage should be painted in a way that maybe is it it has I guess a lot of detail, but at the same time, a lot of the work doesn't have, I suppose, the traditional thing that you might think landscape painting would have, which is directional light. There's a kind of flatness.
Yeah, there is a flatness. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I suppose part of that is evolved quite naturally out of different styles of painting, but also I think conceptually maybe it has some connections with the idea of the kind of deadening light of a sort of arcade, a video game, or a shopping center.
Oh yeah.
So thinking again about how perhaps the natural world, the way it's maybe constructed and presented, for example, within the city, perhaps has that doesn't have quite the same sort of sense of natural light that you might find in the real world.
Yeah, I don't know what it is, but as you say, the sort of flat quality of it, it's terribly seductive in a way. I absolutely just love looking at it. But as you say, it's an odd thing because it is unreal to a degree, or sort of even more hyper-real, or sort of sense of fictional existence. But it's also just looks rather beautiful. I just love all and this one with the sort of, I don't know if it's a Yeti chatting with a guy, but
yeah, it's a Bigfoot shaking hands with a walker, I guess.
So cool.
Yeah, so I've been interested a little bit in the sort of, so I suppose, the signifiers of wild nature, and I've painted bears quite often. We talk about your rocks in your pocket story earlier, but I've also painted mythical sort of creatures as well. So in a way, the hermit, is a real thing, but I think about the ornamental hermit as a kind of copy of the real thing. Then I think about, particularly the Bigfoot. It seems to me as has this wonderfully seductive quality. I certainly remember as a child, it comes from that, of watching Arthur C. Clarke's Mysterious World.
I love that. Yeah.
And then being quite seduced by the stories about the footage taken of the Bigfoot in the USA. But I'm also quite interested in the way tourism works, and I painted, I guess, images of people posing for photographs with either the Bigfoot or with a bear, or with somebody in a bear costume, or with a stuffed bear. And this idea of, I suppose, how, I heard this thing that the average stopping time for a lot of tourists at the Grand Canyon was about sort of 10 minutes. And I think it was enough time to leap off a coach, take some photographs, and get back on again. And I'm not sure if that's true, but it's one of those statistics that probably can't really be proved. But I suppose it sums up an idea about encountering nature through tourism, which sometimes can really cater for those who want to be comfortable. And so this idea of making it paintings of people who pose for photographs as a souvenir with, I don't know, somebody in a bear costume, which in a way is a signifier of wild nature. To me, it sort of sums up a kind of comfortable encounter with the wild. And the same is, I suppose, true of the Bigfoot. Probably in my imagination, this Bigfoot is real, but I've made paintings of, I guess, where it's very, very definitely somebody in a Bigfoot costume.
Has the Bigfoot got very tiny little hands?
Yeah. He's got quite big feet and tiny hands.
Tiny. It's really bizarre, actually. It's kind of throws you out a bit. I love it. I love it. It's a really I suppose I mean, the Bigfoot's so straightforward and friendly and kind of genteel, and it's done in such a serious fashion. There's probably people who believe it really happened.
Well, of course it really happened.
No, I love it. I love it. It's yeah, it's brilliant. Go on. Keep moving on to the next
Okay, well,
installment.
let's see.
Oh, right, that's quite interesting. That's like is that meant to be sort of like one of those like a part of a museum, maybe?
Yeah, so it's quite interested in again how the nature and
Yeah.
how it's presented within museums. And a colleague of mine showed me these images a while ago of the Natural History Museum in New York.
Okay.
And there's this wonderful, if you look online, if you look for sort of images of people constructing diorama
Yeah.
from the early part of the 20th century, you'll find these extraordinary images, which you get these people in almost lab coats,
Oh, really?
or perhaps they're wearing workers' uniforms, in these what look like natural environments.
Oh, so
Probably
actually,
hoovering a sort of tiger or something,
fantastic.
and
So
or trying to, I don't know, trying to place a skin on a taxidermy elephant, and there's just all working with these giant kind of millipedes. They're extraordinary images. There's something a little bit strange and surreal, and I think part of my interest is also is juxtaposing elements together that might create something that's humorous or surprising. In this painting, it's I suppose I was interested in, again, in constructing my own version of the sort of museum diorama and placing these two kind of workmen who are here to finish off or just maintain a diorama of these Neanderthals, I guess, who are in a cave with a sort of painted backdrop and going about their business, which might be anything from making a fire to chewing on this skin. So I guess it also comes down to another idea about immersing oneself in landscape and trying to question our sort of often a desire to retreat into nature. And perhaps there's a little bit there of thinking about, for the landowners and the owners of the ornamental hermit, maybe there's something about seeing the hermit as almost a surrogate of someone who could stand in for them, so they don't have to do the sort of the hard work of retreating into a hermitage and live in a simple life. They can pay someone to do it for them. Exactly. But I guess there's also how we might identify with I don't know, the idea of the cave person, placing ourselves into that, maybe some small latent desire to retreat back into a more a sort of more simple, natural state. So I guess that comes up from time to time in the work as well.
Yeah, I read ages. I was reading one of those Picasso biographies ages ago, and apparently, I mean, there's numerous reasons why Picasso would have done this, but I think it was Francois Gillot, when he was with her, he told her to always be naked when she was wandering around or working in the garden, because he wanted it to be like one of his sort of idyllic sort of Greek paintings. So he wanted her wandering around the garden naked so that he could sort of imagine it was these Greek sort of carefree things that was taking place. So I mean, it's yeah, it comes along.
Wow, I didn't know that. That it certainly chimes with some of the things I've been saying. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's really weird.
Yeah, and I suppose there's smaller versions of that idea of the museum diorama. So there we have.
Oh yeah.
Man versus bear.
Oh, that is so cool. That's a lovely painting. But you've once again, you've got these gorgeous little formal qualities in it. That blue square in the background and the edges of black around it. It's all. I mean, it's beautifully created in an abstract sense as well.
Oh, thanks, Rob. But yeah, I suppose. I suppose it goes back again. Yeah, I think I'm aware that about those things, about placing different kinds of, I don't know if the right word is pictorial languages, but certainly delighted in some of the more abstract sort of formal elements of the work, and that can occur to, through painting, as you say, this blue backdrop and seeing that as one, geometric shape. It could occur, for example, in the ways in which, in a painting like this, the floor is geometric. I suppose there's a suggestion here of almost like of crazy paving or something, but again, it's more of a sort of an interest in creating a more sort of abstract geometric element in the work.
Absolutely.
But I think you could also get involved in some of the more, some of the ways in which some of the smaller, more detailed renderings of, say, the mountains. It's like you get sort of quite, drawn into small elements of the painting. And then they sort of draw you in, I guess.
But it's interesting. Those abstract bits sort of highlight the artifice element of the whole thing. Those sort of.
Yes, I guess so, because then it gives you a sort of license to think of, I suppose, to suggest that sort of idea of, a floor that is, it becomes a more, I suppose, abstracted version of something. And so takes it away from a more naturalistic reading, I guess, of the work.
Yeah, and I thought in the bigger painting just below with the guys setting up the thing, that the two working guys who are building the diorama, they almost look like they're the same person existing at the same time because they're in the same position.
Yeah.
So they've got a slightly unreal.
Probably me again, isn't it?
They've got an unreal quality to them as well.
Yeah. No, that's right. I think they're all a bit like that. They're all a version of me in a sense, and maybe that's partly pragmatic and partly, an interest in the idea of the self-portrait, perhaps.
Yeah.
And placing oneself within the narrative.
Absolutely. So would you, without being too cheeky, would you have wanted to have been the hermit, to have tested out the hermit experience?
I don't think so, but interestingly, I used to rent studios in London for years in old industrial buildings for like 20 odd years, and then I moved to the edge of London, to the suburbs of Croydon, which has given me lots of subject matter, I must say. I think there's something perhaps about Croydon being kind of on the edge, about its pretensions and the failures of those pretensions, about its kind of image. But something interesting about also moving to the suburbs of, a town that is a kind of outskirt. But when I moved here, I have a studio in the garden now, so I'm working in a cabin, in a garden.
In a lockdown.
And during lockdown, you feel as though you're very much enacting the hermit. But quite a few years ago, I was asked to make an animation for an exhibition. I didn't know how to make it, but I realised that you could do a very simple version of rotoscoping, where you basically trace over stills from a moving image. And so I did shoot a lot of myself dressed as a hermit doing various actions. So a lot of this footage does exist. And I guess there is a part of me that thinks, well, this practice could expand at some point and involve something of the performative and something of, perhaps the photographic of the film, where perhaps I immerse myself more in the character of the hermit. But it's still bubbling under. It's not really been extended that much in the practice yet.
Because the other hermit thing that comes to my mind is obviously Gaudi made all those mad cathedrals with all the crazy bits that are still being built. I can't remember where it is now, but anyway, I remember going to see all the crazy cathedrals, and then you went to see where he lived, and he lived literally like a hermit in a sort of weird little room with a Bible. So he made those mad things with the colour, but lived with nothing.
Yes, that's interesting, because I guess the Sagrada Familia is such an extravagant, expression, isn't there? And it's such an extravagant gesture to God, I guess, and to faith, and to and then to see on the flip side of that expression being made in this incredibly humble and modest kind of way. Yeah, it's interesting. Again, I didn't know that.
Yeah, I just really stuck with me because it was a weird contrast. So we've got a little bit more time. Do you want to show us a couple more pictures, maybe, and then we'll, if there's any others you feel that.
Well, I guess I could talk briefly about this one, which I haven't. Just because I suppose I'm trying to think. There's two examples. One which I suppose I haven't got an example quite here. Maybe there's a small example here I can show you in a sec.
Okay.
So two things. One which is I suppose this perhaps harks back to subjects that I sort of worked with in the past, which is an interest in ideas of aspiration and sort of failure, and the idea of, again, the suburbs and places that are on the outskirts. So I have made a few paintings in the past of skateboarders and people who race cars for fun on the weekend in small towns. And I suppose it maybe harks back to maybe growing up in the suburbs of Swansea in South Wales, about dreaming of moving somewhere else. And also to a residency I sort of did in Berwick-upon-Tweed, which is a border town.
Just Roll,
quite a few years ago now.
Factory, isn't it? They made the pastry, the Just Roll pastry.
Oh,
sorry.
Your information bank knows no bounds.
I used to work for.
I feel like I missed something now. I didn't go on that tour of the Just Roll pastry factory. God damn! Oh, it's always a reason to return.
It's shut down now. Anyway.
Oh gosh! But so I suppose that is being, I suppose, expressed in this painting, thinking about the kind of lone skateboarder with aspirations to be perhaps elsewhere, perhaps emulating his sort of heroes of California of the late 70s, perhaps, and finding himself in this sort of this, I suppose, this quite lonely ramp and practicing his tricks, but in a fairly depopulated and rural location. So that sums up some of those sorts of ideas. Another thing that I've only got one little painting here.
It's quite strange because those skateboarding ramps normally have more areas around them. He's very isolated, isn't he, on his little skateboard ramp?
Yeah, so it's trying to emphasise that idea. And I suppose when I was in Berwick, one thing that you got there is this picturesque little town. It feels as though it's because it's on the border, it's a little bit rural, and it has this mainline train, which the train track snakes right around the town. So right through the day, you hear the train horn, and you hear the train sort of rattling away on its way down to London or up to Edinburgh, and and you'd see sort of kids who'd be hanging around the Quick Save car park, on their skateboards, and you sort of I'd identify that a little bit and think about that desire to escape, desire to kind of to move on, but also there's a sort of beauty in the outskirt and the small town. This little painting here is maybe it's not the best example, but it is an example of a kind of a whole series of paintings I've made about objects within towns, essentially, or parks that signify, again, the natural world. So I've painted child's cabins, for example, and here this is a litter bin that's made in the form of a log as a way to sort of disguise its kind of true purpose. But as I said, I think Croydon has given me lots of subject matter, because I find myself, I suppose, looking at images of, for example, a child's cabin that was. I remember being on sale in the entrance to a home base store in the Purley Way a few years ago. And the way that they'd made this display was that they brought in these rocks from the from the gardening department, and they brought in a couple of Christmas trees to sort of, to flank this cabin, and it just sort of really reminded me of this sort of archetypal cabin of I don't know, the idea of building a cabin and escaping to it. I thought about things like Little House on the Prairie, or and there was just something about that incongruous juxtaposition of the Pearly Way, which in Croydon is it's where IKEA is, so some people might know it. But it's this very sort of urban, unnatural sort of environment. It's a place of slightly faded sort of retail.
Yeah.
And of course, home base is gone anyway. Yeah. And but you'd find these small signifiers, these small reminders of something much wilder and something that was almost a portal into the natural landscape. So that all of these things would really strike me. And then so I've made a whole series of works that sort of deal with these kinds of signifiers.
Do you sometimes feel it's almost like, because I know that Pearly Way very well, and that IKEA and the two big chimneys that are really odd, and it is an odd sort of desolate suburban area. But do you think somehow when these nature bits and the log cabins creep back in, is it like either nature forcing its way back on us, or us unable to not let nature creep back into these suburban areas?
I suppose that is probably a good and recurrent theme, especially for science fiction writers. You read someone like J.G. Ballard, and The Drowned World is a fantastic example of thinking about, how we are, in a sense, as a human civilized society, we're not, we're sort of pushing nature away, but it encroaches. And nature encroached. I mean, in a way, nature's not encroaching. We've encroached on nature. We've macadammed, the natural world. And when we see foxes, around London, the foxes aren't encroaching on London. London encroached on the foxes' sort of natural, home, which is still a super fascinating sort of idea, So I suppose for the science fiction writer, and actually thinking about the ongoing climate crisis, I guess that notion of nature creeping up on us is a very real thing. And I suppose just in the meantime, seeing the foxes is a sort of reminder about, our place within the world.
Yeah.
But it can be a delightful thing. I still think it's a delightful thing to see kind of wild animals.
Well, we actually had
roaming our sort of tended, beautifully cultivated gardens.
Well, we had a family of foxes who came in the decking in our garden, and of course, to start with, we're filming all these little baby foxes hopping around. But then 5 or 6 weeks later, it all becomes a bit complicated because you've got these foxes living in the garden. What are you going to do?
There's been a lot. I had a family of foxes living underneath my studio.
Really?
This year, which was very worrying. It was a mum and I think two pups, I guess. There. So that was.
Do you just want to give us a quick? I mean, if you're up for it, a quick glimpse of like your paints and the brushes and how it all looks. Everybody loves a quick little look at the studio chaos.
Yes, you can see I'm in a garden.
Yeah, it looks beautiful.
There's a whole set of
nice.
rubbish over here.
Yeah, good. Yeah, the studio rubbish.
Including
that is brilliant.
Which I think my friend Philip Allen gave me years ago.
That is brilliant.
And some tools of the trade, including an old projector.
Projector, of course, lovely.
And paintings in progress.
Painting in progress.
Another sort of example of a museum diorama.
That's extraordinary.
Construction.
Yeah.
And then I don't know where I got this painting table from, but painter and mixture of Michael Harding plus anything else I can get hold of.
Exactly. Yeah.
And pallets are usually old plastic bags.
Plastic bags. Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, I use old bits of like lino and stuff like that. But yeah.
Oh really? Well, there you go.
They just fling them away when they're overused. Great. Great. I've absolutely loved chatting. We should probably try and wind it up. But weirdly enough, obviously, because I think I told you, we've just been off for a family holiday in the Lake District, wandering around, looking at the beauty of nature. Do you still just wander out? Do you like going for walks like in the countryside and stuff like that, or is it always does it just make you start thinking about what am I going to do with this experience?
No, when I've talked about my work in the past, I sometimes talk about that visit to Yosemite, because I think it's a good example of where those two things come together. So that idea of being, I suppose, hyper aware of your surroundings, but at the same time giving yourself over to just a general delight of being surrounded by a beautiful place. So in Yosemite, I was, I think, probably aware of the ways in which the tourism and the way in which our visit was being managed, and the fact that I could get there in a car and I could have a meal and buy a nice souvenir and more importantly, I suppose, take a load of snaps of myself and my partner as a kind of almost a way of validating my visit. Almost saying, well, I've got the souvenir snaps, so that's a great validation. But at the same time, I remember driving in, and when I first glimpsed some of the great sights, seeing Half Dome or whatever, I did feel like crying. I actually did feel almost like an emotional, sublime-like moment because it's a kind of vast sort of space, and I suppose it subliminally makes you think about your place within the world. But there's just something very visceral about that sort of response.
Yeah, there is, totally. Yeah, it does take your breath away. Great. I've loved chatting. Is there anything else you'd like to just say as a final thing? Or?
No, thank you very much for inviting me and for it's been great to have a conversation, and I want to wish England well for the World Cup next year.
Absolutely.
They'll be well in the heat of
yeah, they won't do well in that, will they? Fantastic. I love chatting. Thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to seeing some of these in real life when there's a next exhibition.
All right.
Thank you.
Good luck. See you again.
Bye.
Okay.
Bumbuckler.